Protect the distribution. We'll see how well we do it. Michael Allen's with me now. Michael, nice to see you again, and good afternoon to you.
Good to see you.
Zelensky was talking over the weekend on CNN about the potential for Russia to use nuclear weapons. Give this a listen.
But it can be true, because when they begin to speak about one or another battles or involve enemies or nuclear weapons or some chemical, don't be afraid, be ready.
That whole thing about don't be afraid, be ready. What he also said is get anti-radiation medicine prepared and air raid shelters. How do you evaluate the potential for Putin to make a decision like this?
Well, it's all very terrifying. The question is Putin so desperate? Is he so worried about a conventional military defeat that he resorts to nuclear weapons or the threat of nuclear weapons, basically to shock his opponents, to shock the Ukrainians into some kind of submission? It really gets to the issue of, we know Putin's a risk taker, but is he also irrational? Will he get to a point where he wants to use tactical nuclear weapons? And that's where the United States and NATO need to step up and say this would lead to unacceptable consequences for Russia if they move down this path.
Yeah, you just heard Griff's report there about protecting the weapons that the West is sending in. I thought President Biden made a substantial decision last Thursday when he said we're going to give $800 million more in military aid. The point is, Michael, we're in this proxy war, and we are in deep at the moment, totaling billions of dollars perhaps in the end. Given that, how do we know as to whether or not that effort is going to where it needs to go, which is primarily the eastern part of the country and the southeast?
Well, it's difficult. We obviously ship things over to Poland and elsewhere in the neighborhood. We're not sure where it's going downrange, so to speak, but I think you're onto something. This is phase 2 of the conflict. It's not going to be just defensive weapons like javelins and stingers. What they need, what the Ukrainians need, are tanks, armored personnel carriers, things that are a lot harder to get over there and a lot harder to get into position. That's why we're calling for so much urgency to get the Ukrainians into the game so when this second phase of the war begins in earnest, they're going to be able to overtake the Russians like they did in the first phase.
Yeah. And when you consider that, how far do you think we're willing to go?
I think we are increasingly willing to give them airplanes. I heard Jake Sullivan back off of the offensive versus defensive artificial standard that we had adopted some weeks ago. I think the question is, how do you get them over to the Ukrainians? I'm also pleased last week we started to give them helicopters. So slowly but surely, I think we're taking off some of the restrictions that we had put on ourselves and are trying to arm the Ukrainians for this, the next phase of the war. The Russians aren't doing so badly in the south, and they're about to double down in the east. So we've got a long way to go, and we need to look after our friends and allies.
If you give them the airplanes, does that expand the war? Does Ukraine then fly into Russia and targets on the other side?
I don't think so. I think there's plenty they can do to control their own sky.
Well, Michael, great to have you back. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Michael Allen with us from Washington, D.C. Thank you for that. I mean, if you give them airplanes, Sandra, very interesting to see which way the war goes.
Indeed.